I hope everyone's doing well and you had a wonderful Pesach. It was great to see so many people back in shul. We're getting the kids' programs back slowly but surely. And God willing, we'll get back to normal. It just takes time. And we're assessing. We want to make sure that we come back better and more accommodating than ever. But it's a process. When it comes to Parshas Shemini, at the end of the Seder, we have a set of laws that are very familiar. It's really the hallmark of being Jewish. It's right up there with Shabbos and family purity, and that is kashrus. And at the end of the list of what we're allowed to eat, what we're not allowed to eat, the pasuk says that I am Hashem hamala eschem me'eretz Mitzrayim. I elevated you. It doesn't say I took you out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt, but I elevated you. And Rashi brings from Chazal that this kashrus is something which is outstanding. It makes us special. When I was a kid growing up in a smaller town in the 60s and 70s, and I saw others who were able to eat what they wanted, and we were limited, I didn't consider it to be necessarily a maila, an advantage, especially as we became more informed and you couldn't trust ingredients, and not every gum was kosher, and not every chocolate was kosher. It was a big blow to a young kid. So it's not necessarily the first impulse to think that kashrus helps us. But we have to appreciate on a spiritual level, and the Ramban talks about this, that the special code of kashrus really protects our neshamos, our souls. It's the DNA, it's the purity of the Jewish people that makes us special, and we have to embrace it. There's a story that's told over. It goes back to the days of the Chassam Sofer, who was one of the great leaders of Torah Jewry in the 19th century, early 19th century. And he had in his Kehila in Pressburg, which was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Hungary, he had two Jews, merchants, who were very wealthy. And in those days, if you were in the mercantile system, you would travel to far-flung places, to Europe, to sell your merchandise. And two merchants ended up, who were they ended up in Spain. And this is well after the Inquisition. But being a Jew in Spain was still somewhat of a risk because some of those laws were still in place. Someone who practiced Judaism publicly could be forced to convert. It's hard to believe, but that was still in place during that time. So two Jews are in Spain trying to be incognito, and they're arrested because there's suspicion that maybe their cargo was illicit and it was contraband, whatever the case was, and they're taken to the custom officers. But because there was a good relationship between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Spain, they were treated with respect. They weren't held in jail, and in fact they were invited to the homes of the custom officers for lunch. So they were in a predicament because on one hand it could have been pikuach nefesh, life-threatening, and they were asked to dine with these officials and it wasn't kosher. So one of the two was hesitant to eat, and his host immediately saw that there was uneasiness. He took him to an attic, and it was an amazing story, a revelation that the host, this one host, was really one of the Anusim, meaning he was from the Jews of Spain who didn't leave. They converted superficially to Christianity, but they practiced Judaism in private. And he showed him the challah. He said, I'm Jewish also. And he took out the knife for shechita, and he said, everything here is kosher. So here this Jew had the great fortune that he wasn't forced to eat something that was unkosher, even if it would have been technically justified. And he was able to emerge from this crisis unscathed. The other Jew, who was also under surveillance, he was hosted by a real Christian, a Catholic, and he made the decision to eat the non-kosher food because he felt that it was justified. It was pikuach nefesh. They come back to the Chassam Sofer, and the one who ate non-kosher had a guilty conscience. And he was bothered. Why was it my fate that I was put in that situation? And my friend, he had the good fortune that he was served kosher food because it was a converso, one of these Jews who was in secret really keeping halacha. And the Chassam Sofer said, I have a tradition from my teacher, Rabbi Nosson Adler, that if you were ever uncareful, you were not scrupulous when it came to kashrus, so that could leave a person vulnerable. And you have to think back, was there ever a time in your life that you weren't careful? And he thought back to a Maisa. We're running out of time on the video, but he was young, he had smicha, his wife showed him a question about a chicken, and he paskined that it was okay, but it was really out of ignorance. It was a complicated shaila. They took it to another rabbi. The rabbi didn't want to get involved in the shalom bayis once her husband had paskined, but it was a questionable chicken. And the Chassam Sofer said, that's it. You have to be careful. And those who are careful with kashrus, that mal-yusa, that advantage, that purity of the neshama will yield opportunities where a person will be protected. So what's the moral of the story? That we shouldn't look at kashrus as an obstacle, as an impediment to cut corners. Baruch Hashem, in our day and age, we have so much available. It wasn't always the case, as we mentioned. But it's something that justified our exodus. This is a hallmark of being Jewish, something to embrace and be proud of. I wish everybody a good Shabbos, and looking forward to seeing you in Shul.